I'd like to give a warm welcome to Liz Rankin. I'm very delighted to have you join us today, and I think everybody knows you, so you don't need much introduction. But for the occasional person who doesn't, Liz is really well known in South Africa for having done incredible work on South African art. She's from South Africa and left in the 1990s to relocate to New Zealand, where she became Professor of Art History at the University of Auckland. Prior to that, she was at Wits and she was Chair and Professor of History of Art, as well as serving 2 terms as Dean. So we really welcome her here today. She's done fantastic work on South African art, but she's adapted it in recent years to also do work on New Zealand art. And we're very interested in what she's going to say today on the topic of postcolonial perceptions and imagining New Zealand history via 2 artists' works. So over to Liz.
Oh, thank you, Brenda. I kind of feel as though I'm joining a family over there with these scattered presentations and working with some of your students as well. I don't know if Jacqueline has perhaps joined you today. She did plan to. So where to begin on an area of art that Brenda had asked me to speak about last April when I was coming for a conference, but which is now belatedly making an appearance, but will still be as foreign to you as it would then. If your knowledge of New Zealand is anything like mine when I applied for the Chair of Art History at Auckland over 20 years ago, you may need a brief introduction to contextualize the artworks I'm going to discuss. Candidly, I even needed to locate New Zealand. And now I'm not getting this moving. Sorry, chaps, just trying to figure out why this isn't moving along, since it was doing so very nicely before. Let's do it with that if I have to. So, as I say, New Zealand sometimes falls off world maps, and I needed to do a little bit of research to discover where it was I was headed, first for an interview, then to stay. In fact, it's 2 substantial islands. They're larger than Britain, but it's got this tiny population. It hadn't reached 4 million when I arrived in 1998, but today it's a bit over 5, boosted by the return of thousands of Kiwis during COVID. New Zealand, in fact, used to be the same continent as Africa and split off from Gondwana land about 85 million years ago and developed a unique ecosystem. I was blown away to find that there are no mammals in New Zealand, no indigenous mammals, bar a single bat species. So it was first populated in the 13th century by Polynesian voyagers. And in relative isolation, they developed the independent Maori culture. Europeans arrived much later. First Abel Tasman in 1642, representing the Dutch, who in fact gave the name New Zealand. More than a century later, in 1769, Cook mapped the islands on an expedition from Britain to the Pacific to record the transit of Venus. The first French expedition reached New Zealand the same year, and Cook returned twice. These voyages were generally exploratory and peaceful, but were not without loss of life for both resident Maori and visiting Europeans. South Pacific colonization began in earnest in 1788 with Australia's penal colony, and soon after, whalers started using New Zealand as a base, setting up small settlements. Early in the 19th century, missionaries arrived. The British Crown was approached on a number of occasions because of a lack of law and order and the hazards of Maori wars now supplied with muskets. Imperial competitiveness with the French no doubt also encouraged Britain to colonize the colony. Britain sent an official resident in 1843, and then the first Governor Hobson arrived in 1840, after the New Zealand Company had been buying up land and transporting British settlers to New Zealand. The important Treaty of Waitangi was signed in February that year to establish British sovereignty, but also to protect Maori rights. The treaty did not prevent ongoing strife. The growing number of settlers, known as Pākehā, were pressuring for land, and this led to war with Maori and the confiscation of territory from those who resisted government troops. It hardly honoured the spirit of the treaty. While Maori numbers declined, British settlers multiplied exponentially. There are still ongoing debates about the treaty today, complicated by differences between the English and Maori versions. In 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal was established to look into treaty breaches and provide compensation to Maori iwi that had been mistreated. Initially only contemporary claims, but then extended to cases dating back to the signing in 1840, pictured here for the centenary of the treaty. Please forgive the potted history, but I hope it gives you some idea of the issues involved. And the painting of the treaty will have alerted you to the existence of a pedestrian yet romanticized representation of the past. Paintings of Maori with sentimental titles, like those of Charles Goldie, encouraged a nostalgic view of a vanishing lifestyle. Colonial images, on the other hand, valorized figures such as Captain Cook. Given recent debates about South African monuments, I thought you might be interested to see that these have not gone unscathed. The Titirangi Hill sculpture, erected in 1969 for the 200th anniversary of Cook's first landing, was installed on Maori ancestral land, and it has been recited as a result of protests about Cook the Crook during the 250th anniversary. The issues around such sculptures and the ongoing debates about the Waitangi Tribunal intimate that, as for many colonial countries, New Zealand history is complex and contentious and recounted by two distinct sets of voices, those of First Nation peoples and those of colonisers. Retelling the conflicting stories is a challenging task, which I want to explore in the work of two Pākehā artists, printmaker Marian Maguire and painter Michael Shepherd. They address similar issues, but so differently that I'll discuss their work separately, drawing some comparisons as I go along. Marian Maguire trained at the University of Canterbury, then specialised in lithography at the Tamarind Studios in Albuquerque. To negotiate her way through the duality of Maori and settler history, she draws analogy with a third set of narratives, the epic tales of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, complicating colonial conflicts with the myths and legends of ancient Greece. Using postmodern strategies that draw on diverse, seemingly incongruous visual sources, Maguire puts to the test the heroic stories that underpin European accounts of voyages and victories in the southern seas. The linear decorations of Greek vases coexist in her work with colonial New Zealand imagery. And this is most easily understood in this, her first series of etchings called Southern Myths. We recognize Greek heroes like Achilles and Ajax from Exekias's famous black figure vase, which translates so well into the black and white of prints. But while the figures in the vase painting have no setting, here they're located in New Zealand. In one, this is indicated by two tall tree ferns. In the other, a well-known 19th century watercolour of Milford Sound is called into service, even providing the title for the etching. This seems a simple enough makeover, referencing New Zealand warriors, but the transformations are far from simplistic. For example, Maguire uses Ezekiel's figure of Achilles slaying the Amazon queen, Penthesilea, twice, once for the same theme at the top, but also for Achilles slaying Hector of Troy. As with the previous examples, the mythical events are located in New Zealand through plant life and landscape. It's easy to see how van der Velden's moody painting of Atira Gorge lends drama to the Trojan combat, made ghostly by a complex reverse etching technique. The reference for Achilles' encounter with Penthesilea is a botanical drawing of a New Zealand plant made by Sidney Parkinson, artist on Cook's first voyage. But this does more than simply locate the scene and set it in the past, because the mature plant develops a spear-like form, popularly known as lancewood, which underlines Penthesilea's fate. Maguire's next series, coloured lithographs entitled The Odyssey of Captain Cook, develops the complexity of referencing further with irony and wit. Cook and the Maori he meets are drawn from 18th century images, but she adds Greek vases to the iconography. In Cook's arrival, the vase refers to the luggage of Western culture that he brings with him, and the vase's warrior images suggest the conflict that results. In Cook's portrait, the inclusion of a vase, which we're told is now in the Admiralty collection, reminds us of the acquisitiveness of European travellers, pillaging both Greek and New Zealand trophies. Here too, the vase portrays animosity between explorers and inhabitants, as a Maori and a Greek figure seem to confront each other, although they're actually attacking a boar. It's a humorous reference to Cook, as the pigs he left behind in New Zealand that flourished in the wild are colloquially known as Captain Cookers. The fatal outcome of some of the voyages is represented in the funerary urn that Maguire created for Cook, based on an 18th century image of his death in Hawaii. It has a personal twist in the decorations on the neck of the vase, where we see a jaunty ship setting out on its travels, but a melancholy vessel returning at slow pace as it tows the funerary urn, flag at half-mast. There are more amiable encounters between Maori and explorers, again imagined through Ezekiel's vase painting of Achilles and Ajax playing draughts. In this image, Maguire employs a New Zealand setting, a much-loved watercolour of iconic Mount Taranaki by 19th century surveyor Charles Heafy. He called the mountain by its English name, Mount Egmont, which Maguire picks up in her title. The identity of the players is more clearly seen in the closer view, where the Maori is derived from a Parkinson drawing, his topknot and comb replacing Achilles' crested helmet, while the foreign voyager is Greek, closely based on the vase design. The same sources appear in an image with a bilingual title, Ko Wai Koi, Who Are You? It captures the puzzled confrontation of inhabitants and newcomers who seem equally strange to each other and equally unable to make themselves understood. The dark silhouette of the Greek warrior with his tall helmet implies the conflict that is to come. The delicate drawing of the Maori figure, derived from a 19th century image by de Saint-Saëns, seems more credible, more grounded in the real world. The bewilderment they share is underlined by the close relationship of Maori facial tattoos and engraved patterns on the Greek helmet. Now, it may seem as if Maguire has used Greek prototypes to signal cultural superiority for the European voyages. But in a work from her next series, she reverses the figures' identities. Now it is the Greek Heracles, recognized by his lion pelt, that follows de Saint-Saëns' drawing, minus the tattoo, while the Maori who confronts him is based on depictions of Greek heroes, albeit with a distinctive Maori comb and topknot. This pair give us pause to think about land issues signalled by the title. Heracles discusses boundary issues with the neighbours. and about Maori warriors pitted against the superior numbers and firepower of British troops, a theme we'll also find in the work of Michael Shepherd. This print belongs to Maguire's suite called The Labours of Heracles. As the introductory lithograph shows, Heracles represents the New Zealand settler, clearing the bush and felling trees for timber, planting and tending flocks and herds, surveying the land and carrying off artifacts, a witty cross-cultural theft of a Maori carving for a Greek temple. Heracles undertakes his various labours in New Zealand terms. Capturing the Ceryneian hind becomes Heracles Goes Hunting, the ancient hero armed with a rifle and a bandolier worn over his lion skin. Settlers introduced various species for their hunting pleasure, and in the manner of Greek vases, Heracles and these new animals are identified by name: deer, rabbit, possum, and so forth. Only the native kiwi in its burrow under the tree needs no identification. Something of the problem caused by these imports is captured in one of Maguire's whimsical etchings. Heracles attempts rabbit control, obviously unsuccessfully, as rabbits couple beneath his feet, multiplying faster than he can eradicate them, still a problem for farmers today. Heracles also takes up dairy farming, drawn from a vase painting for his 10th labour, retrieving the cattle of Geryon, again in a New Zealand setting by Heafy. It's less important to acknowledge the sources than to spot the differences. How the bush in the background has been replaced by a plantation of trees, and an invasive foxglove grows alongside native tree ferns. Significantly, too, the Greek bull has had a sex change, acquiring the udder necessary for dairy farming. Working with livestock creates problems, and Heracles attempts to train 3-headed Kerberos as a sheepdog, while 2 black-faced sheep look on very nervously. Another witty etching shows him trying to overcome the Amazons without success. The reference here is to New Zealand suffragettes, the earliest in the world to win the vote in 1893. These colonial Amazons may be backed by Greek Athena, but are depicted in 19th century dresses with high heels and handbags. To write home, Heracles has abandoned his lion skin over the back of his chair as he sits in front of the fire, enjoying respite from the stray sheep above and the devastated landscape glimpsed through a window. The souvenirs on his mantelpiece are Greek tourist kitsch, a postcard of the Parthenon, a figurine of Venus de Milo, and a small Greek amphora, although it depicts the death of Cook. The bookshelf above imagines what an English settler might read. There's a Bible, Captain Cook's Voyages, Mrs. Beeton's cookbook, and others on farming and carpentry, but also Boardman's publication on Greek vases and a droll Maguire invention, a Greek Maori dictionary. It is this literate Heracles who signs the Treaty of Waitangi on behalf of the Crown, backed by Queen Victoria and the Union Jack, and witnessed by a splendid Maori chief, supported by the carving of an ancestor. Heracles is aware that the Maori are a force to be reckoned with. In one lithograph, he shows visible signs of strain as a Maori spirit, or taniwha, appears amidst the smoke of the forest fires. And as more and more settlers arrive, it is this formidable taniwha that he wrestles with in the final image, just as Heracles wrestled with Titan. The works are captivating and often amusing, but also raise serious issues about colonial aspirations and First Nation rights. Settlement struggles are the subject of another series on Maori military strategist, Tito Kawaru, far more challenging for a Pākehā artist than settler history. Here the landscape setting does more than identify New Zealand, as Mount Taranaki was Tito Kawaru's home territory. Maguire portrays him as a thinker, unexpectedly debating profound philosophical questions with Socrates, recognizable from ancient portrait busts. But the pressing question that concerns the Maori General as he ponders the embers of his fire is what to do about the relentless arrival of British settlers who want to set up farms on the fertile land around Mount Taranaki. They're portrayed in repeated bands encircling the vase. In 1867, Tita Kuaru led peaceful protest marches, but to no avail. His efforts at reconciliation failed to halt the onset of settlers who became increasingly greedy for land. Maguire's title, Bilingual Amphora, refers in scholarship to Greek vases that deploy both black and red figure decoration, which she mimics here, but also refers to New Zealand's two languages and the problems of intercultural communication. Equally ingenious is her deployment of academic conventions to label the lithograph called Cause and Effect, which depicts both sides of two vases as though in a scholarly tone, with earnest attributions and documentation of the A and B sides. On the top vase, by the confiscation painter, settlers enjoy genteel tea drinking on the A side, while on B, soldiers despoil the fields and set fire to Maori homes to drive them out. In the face of this, Tita Kuaru devised a new strategy seen on the vase by the provocation painter. Maori made forays against British settlers to provoke attack, luring them to his well-fortified power site, pictured on the other side, where hidden sharpshooters ambushed them. British soldiers were unaccustomed to guerrilla tactics, and Tita Kuaru trounced them. For the death of Gustavus von Tempsky, a celebrated captain in the settler troops, Maguire draws an analogy with the death of Sarpedon in the Trojan Wars. Just like the Greek warriors, von Tempsky's soldiers fought and died trying to protect their leader's body, in this case because they feared Maori cannibalism. But Tita Kuaru honoured von Tempsky, and here, instead of mythical figures, warriors carry the body to its funerary pyre. However, the tide turned when Tita Kuaru's troops deserted him, perhaps because he had a liaison with one of his allies' wives. Tita Kuaru reverted to his earlier passive resistance and joined forces with Te Whiti, Maori chief of Parihaka. Te Whiti's followers abhorred violence and resisted European settlement by just taking down fences and ploughing roads built on their ancestral land. Maguire portrays the two leaders discussing what is peace. The contemporary photograph of Mount Taranaki in the background signals the ongoing relevance of the question. Entangled in the rata growth on a nearby tree is the Christchurch statue of Captain Cook, a reminder that these conflicts began with voyages and subsequent colonial occupation. In 1881, 16,000 British troops invaded Parihaka, destroying the peaceful village and incarcerating the two leaders. It's an event that Michael Shepherd also memorializes, but his engagement with the Parihaka story is quite different, as he rarely portrays figures. Like Maguire, he draws on historical material to create his works. Here, an old colonial photograph of the Maori village taken just before the attack. Shepherd was aware that the image would have originated as a negative on a glass plate, signalled by the title of the work. Negative also refers to his response to the event itself, which he underlines by painting a trompe-l'oeil surface as though the glass has been shattered by a blow or a bullet. The reductive tonal palette he favours infers a deep melancholy. Like Maguire, Shepherd also created a commemorative work for von Tempsky. On a visit to Taranaki, he and a historian tried to pinpoint exactly where the captain had died, without success. In his ironic commentary on the vagaries of history, Shepherd paints the forest floor, covered in dead leaves, like the shifting layers of memories and records on which history relies. But the light that shines on them evokes the distinctive shape of Tita Kuaru's defensive pa, where Tempsky was killed. and through the dead leaves, shoots of kawakawa and karaka appear, symbols of bitterness and farewell. I've morphed into Shepherd's oeuvre through themes shared with Maguire and need to backtrack to explore some of his earlier engagement with New Zealand's history. Already a married man in his 20s when he trained at the University of Auckland, Shepherd found himself out of step with the school's modernist experiments. Instead, he created tiny still life studies, drawing on objects from the clutter of the family shed where he'd played as a child, some of them shown here. To paint them, Shepherd taught himself the techniques of the old masters by studying their works in books, so well that his knowledge astounded Rembrandt specialist Ernst van der Wetering at the Rijksmuseum Central Research Laboratory, when Shepherd later had a grant to study there. The diminutive still lifes brought him instant success for their remarkable skill and the sense of nostalgia they evoked. They were intimate, domestic histories, as Shepherd made overt in the title of a later work, My Memories of My Mother's Memory of My Grandmother's Memories. But there is often reference to national history as well. Here it's signalled by overwriting, such as the initials of the Royal Nursing Corps, in which his mother served in World War II. In Shepherd's early still lifes, amidst more everyday objects, we find insignia of the war when his father fought in the crack long-range desert group. Shepherd pored over his North African photo albums as a child, fascinated by the desert light and the long cast shadows echoed in his painting. But he was also drawn to pre-colonial history and included Maori objects, such as a stone adze that he found on the Waikato riverbank when he was only 7. Visiting Maori sites became an ongoing passion. He travelled New Zealand, learning to recognise the remains of fortified pa's and discovering old middens, what he calls the history beneath my feet. The one depicted here from a beach south of Napier shows the shells from seafood that identified the midden, but he's added shells of bullets, suggesting the disruptive intersection of Maori and settler history. Shepherd had grown up in the little town of Ngaruawahia in the Waikato region, an important Maori centre, which gave him insight into the duality of New Zealand culture. It was where the first Maori king had been crowned in 1858, only to be ousted by colonial troops in 1863. It was also where, much later, Princess Tupuia brought her displaced people, decimated by disease, in the wake of the First World War. Although desperately impoverished, they raised funds with a traditional dance group and built the Te Rangawaiwai marae on wasteland on the far side of the river. Extending his familiar still life studies, in 1988, Shepherd created an extraordinary 6-metre panorama of the town, which has to be read sequentially. In Maguire's language, we might call this a bilingual work, because objects representing Pākehā are on the left, including a trinket box, striped shirt, engine cylinder, and fish and chips and newspaper, and Maori on the right, an adze, folded rugby jersey, carved head, and flag of the Maori king. They're set apart by the Waikato River in the centre, marking the cultural divide of the small town. While it was the capital of the Maori king and visited by Queen Elizabeth in 1953, it was also a settler town. In a 1992 view, painted from 2 overlapping postcards to create a sense of perspective, Shepherd sardonically compares the town's modest colonial buildings to Piero della Francesca's ideal city. Tiny Maori figures transporting a waka canoe emerge from behind the right-hand postcard, but whether leaving the town dominated by settlers or arriving to assert their presence at Te Rangawaiwai is uncertain. Shepherd was prompted to look at the Waikato for subject matter in 1990, when New Zealand celebrated the sesquicentennial, 150 years since the Treaty of Waitangi. Waikato was the area where, in contravention of the treaty, British troops invaded in 1863 to wrest land from Maori who would not pledge allegiance to Queen Victoria as their sole monarch. Significant histories were embedded in the area and its small rundown towns like Ngaruawahia and Mercer. Shepherd revisited Mercer, named after a fallen captain of the New Zealand Wars, asking a friend to take photographs at random as they walked about, then used them to create a photo album for a fictive visitor of a former resident of Mercer. For Shepherd, there was never the option of making a collage of the photographs. Instead, they meticulously recreated in paint as though taped onto the back on black background, making a photograph album, as it were, with the protagonist's memories painstakingly inscribed in white. There isn't time to read all the complex texts, but there is a telling repeated refrain. Mercer never seems to change, but the photos don't seem to have the past in them. The Waikato River was the heart of the area, a major means of transport, and used for gunboats in the 19th century land wars. Over a composite of river photographs, Shepherd painted a ghostly image of the boat with Tapuia and her followers being towed to a new location upstream after World War I. Shepherd was intrigued with the town's memorial for the war. Absurdly, the figure is not a New Zealand soldier at all, but a British Tommy, imported from Italy, which churned out these statues by the hundred. Moreover, it's mounted on the old turret of the pioneer gunboat that waged war against the Maori in the 19th century, hardly likely to promote a sense of unity in an area that still bears the scars of the land wars. Shepherd decided to make his own ironic monument for the sesquicentennial, contradicting the unity proclaimed in the sanguine slogan, "One land, one people," as there are all too obviously two peoples. Like Maguire, Shepherd uses a series to narrate 19th century Waikato hostilities, but in a set of faux carved stone panels. And he deliberately mimics the gaucheness of amateurish provincial memorials. Like her too, he drew on scholarship, in this case Bellich's revisionist history of the New Zealand Wars, tellingly subtitled The Victorian Interpretation of Racial Conflict. Shepherd selected an account of the little-known Battle of Koheroa in 1863, when a small Maori band succeeded in holding a hilltop against the first charge of British troops under General Duncan Cameron. When they realised they were hopelessly outnumbered, the Maori strategically withdrew, and the British then claimed the victory. Shepherd points out to the inaccuracy of records, which are dominated by those in charge of media. As he rallies his men, Cameron's rousing cry proclaims that Auckland newspapers will announce their victory with 147 dead. But this is contradicted by another panel that cites the number of Maori defenders as 125 in total, and most of them escaped. There is also satire in the double meaning of building bridges, its positive social connotations contradicted by the literal bridging of the Mangatawhiri River to invade the Waikato. Shepherd does not rely on his simulated carved inscriptions alone, but overwrites them with graffiti. One monarch, denying the Maori king, and we won, ironically modified to we are one. Another battle with a dubious victory took place in Rankin, where British troops failed to capture the Maori king and suffered 131 casualties. Shepherd worked from an engraving in the Illustrated London News, which showed colonial soldiers occupying the vacated Maori defences. He adds an ironic cross, marking the spot where Captain Mercer reportedly fell. The engraving was based on a photograph, acknowledged by the inclusion of a camera. Shepherd ingeniously modernizes the equipment to project a contemporary image, a copy of a rare self-portrait he had painted, where he takes up the position of the disconsolate figure on the now overgrown ramparts, telescoping the past into the present. As another way of gaining insight into the history of the region, Shepherd has built up a remarkable collection of turn-of-the-century photographs. He noted how the presence of Maori diminished in sequential photographs of the same site on the Waipa River. So when he painted the later view, where Maori had disappeared, he was creating not a nostalgic landscape, but a covert social comment. Shepherd is so well versed in painting the area that in this series, Excavating the Historical, he could equally well invent landscapes, including objects to show traces of devastating incursions by colonial troops. The tiny Miranda still life in the distance on the right is an autobiographical allusion. His early interest in still life was being upstaged by history painting. Shepherd's skepticism regarding the platitudes of the sesquicentennial was well-founded. Poor Maori statistics in health, income, and education fueled discontent about the way treaty claims were being handled. Compensation paid to Maori iwi did not always filter down to the poorest, and those seeking employment often left their ancestral lands, losing touch with their traditional way of life. Although a Labour government had extended the period for claims to the Waitangi Tribunal, in 1995 a national government set a cap of $1 billion, referred to as a fiscal envelope. With his delight in punning language, Shepherd created a suite of works with that title, using small rectangles of plywood which mimic official buff envelopes, with their red frame and heading on government business only. Furbished with trompe-l'oeil stamps and post office imprints, they provide an enigmatic commentary on the politics of the tribunal. For example, most of them have postage owing stamps, indicating that claims have not yet been met. An exception is the envelope addressed to the Tainui Trust, where the stamp has been cancelled because that claim had been honoured. But further notations track exceptions. One subgroup has the comment, land not confiscated, while another is stamped, gone, no address. The latter comment is a reminder of how Maori had dispersed, and another envelope addressed to all Maori of unknown lineage refers to the many who had moved to urban centres in search of work, becoming out of touch with their roots. It carries the dispiriting imprints, unknown to rural carrier and too late, too late. Debates about the Waitangi Tribunal and the settlements of claims led to a focus on the interpretation of the treaty itself and the discrepancies between the English and Maori versions. When the new National Museum Te Papa opened in 1998, the core exhibition focused on this founding document, a reproduction enlarged like some sacred stained glass window. And you'll recall that Maguire devoted a lithograph to it in her Heracles series. Shepherd's response was to paint a treaty as a highly deceptive faux document written on aging vellum with all the appropriate seals and signatures, and a tongue-in-cheek stamp in the upper corner for the National Archive in Wellington that houses the original document. It's a compelling illusion, seemingly authentic at first, but it proves impossible to actually read, particularly on the Maori side, which has an even darker patina. Another twice-folded document called Agreement purports to map a claim being considered by the tribunal, its case number in the lower corner. It's labelled Native Land on the upper left, with the confiscation boundary neatly demarcated on the right. But on the land further right, we read Rapa Nui in red letters. That's the Maori word for confiscation. It may seem that Shepherd always sides with the underdog, constantly taking issues with the action of the Crown, whether in military battles of the 19th century or the legal ones of the 20th. However, he is well aware of shortcomings on both sides and reflects the absurdity of some of the aspirations of both in his work. In another faux document, Old Values, he includes grandiose Pākehā plans for the town of Ngaruahia never realised. It was to be laid out in the form of a Union Jack, with Cameron Square in the centre named for the victorious general, and other ostentatiously imperial street names like Wellington and Nelson. The unfamiliar banknote, on the other hand, was to be a new currency for an independent bank set up by the Maori king, which also never materialised. An aspect of New Zealand history that has preoccupied Shepherd in recent years is the history of the land itself. Both Maori and Pākehā have been complicit in destroying the natural habitat of New Zealand. Maori hunted to extinction the moa, the largest flightless bird in the world, and initiated the destruction of the forests. But this was nothing compared to the devastation that followed colonial occupation, when trees were felled for shipping on a grand scale, recorded in Shepherd's portentous painting, Monument for a Holocaust Museum. The deaths in this case, trees, not humans. As we've seen, Maguire too acknowledged the role that settlers played in the desecration of the land, depicting logging, farming, surveying, and the introduction of alien species. Shepherd was aware of how few wetlands, which he painted from early in his career, had survived, as colonists cleared and drained the land in the belief that they were developing it, but destroying the ecosystem. He records the loss of indigenous biota, showing how a piece of turf, mimicking Dürer's famous work, reveals only introduced species. And he paints the devastating effects of farming. In The Fall of Icarus, he captures the violence of modern machinery, creating a morass of sludge and spattered mud, as opposed to the orderly furrows being ploughed in Bruegel's eponymous work. Another painting, sardonically titled Commonwealth, comments on the effect of spraying with insecticides, and a failed railway line and debris in the foreground mock commercial achievements. These works used acrylic paint that not only allowed Shepherd to develop more fluid techniques, but also to incorporate mixed media. And in The Promised Land, he shows a female figure drowning in a sea of grain amidst a maelstrom of dust and spores. Perhaps it is the Maori earth goddess, Papa Tuanuku, overcome by settler agriculture. I've avoided talking about works concerned with international wars, which may seem less directly post-colonial. Yet they too were part of that history, when British colonies were dragged into world wars to support empire, and Maori and Pākehā fought side by side. That is the subject of Maguire's lithograph, where Heracles urges the soldiers on to battle at Gallipoli, the site of great losses for New Zealand soldiers in World War I. Nearly 3,000 died there, an enormous toll when the population numbered just over 1 million. And it is remembered each year on Anzac Day, as it is in Australia too. Shepherd engaged with this traumatic conflict when he was invited to Gallipoli with a group of New Zealand and Australian artists in 2014 to make works for the upcoming centenary. But soldiers in Shepherd's work are marginal. His focus is the beachheads where they died, his paintwork incorporating sand from New Zealand with that of Gallipoli, symbolically linking the sites. Maguire, on the other hand, foregrounds individuals, commissioned in 2013 by the Ministry of Defence to create a lithograph to commemorate 70 years of New Zealand's service in the Pacific. She drew a group of slightly tongue-in-cheek, virile men representing Army, Navy, and Air Force, but pride of place is reserved for a compassionate portrayal of Harry Odlum, a 92-year-old veteran of the Second World War. The commemorative work that Shepherd made in 2017 is bizarre. Prompted by the 50th anniversary of the Beatles' record, Sgt. Pepper, he remembered the striking album cover and his boyish interest in whether the drum might have been a genuine regimental one. On the internet, he discovered documentation of the photo shoot with the drum seen at an angle, showing that it indeed had World War I battle clasps. Shepherd then endowed the drum with local significance, inscribing the clasps with the names of battle sites from the New Zealand Wars and the First World War: Rangariri, Gate Pa, Orikau, Samoa, Gallipoli, Ypres, Passchendaele. The red Anzac poppy in the foreground confirms the work's commemorative purpose, while the kiwi extracting itself from a silver coin reinforces the New Zealand connection, and the year that this decimal coinage was introduced, 1967, which was also the date of the Beatles' album. Shepherd's allusions are never simple. The complexity of reading his work parallels that of Maguire's. In different media, but with equally superb skill, they create images that question and reinterpret, demanding our serious attention to history and politics. They share a deep affection for their homeland, yet engage critically with its past and the interaction of Maori and Pākehā, unwilling to accept received history unthinkingly. Yet they tackle it with humour. It's suggested by the quirkiness of Shepherd's commemorative piece, and also when he mocks his own practice. For example, he addressed an undelivered faux envelope to himself via postmodernism and stamped it, posted without contents. We've already noted Maguire's witty details in her large lithographs. Alongside those, she often produced smaller etchings, such as these colonial encounters, unexpected cross-cultural assignations, where the titles are as diverting as the images. A Maori maiden encounters a Greek satyr that has strayed into New Zealand forests. More primly attired colonial women are just as likely to fall prey to desire, confronted with exotic creatures of the mythological past, as when Dionysus calls on Mrs. Harris and her sister Maud, while their husbands are out on field patrol. Or another is startled by a satyr with Maori tattoos and spills the milk. But these works are not mere humorous titillation, delightful though that may be. They are a comment, obliquely, on the role of women in warfare, whether as powerful motivators like Helen of Troy or as victims of violence and rape. It's perhaps a fitting place to end, showing as it does that for Maguire as for Shepherd, however whimsical their imagery, there is always a serious thread of commentary as they bring their personal perceptions to bear on New Zealand history. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for this fascinating engagement. I think you couldn't find a more perfect illustration of Linda Hutchins' emphasis on parody as a postmodern strategy and how meaning is often created not through similarity and likeness, but through difference from the original upon these extraordinary works. I wonder if you might just take some questions about them for us, and I'll kick off in relation to your talk. I was reminded so much of the works of Christine Dixie, in fact, particularly her Bloodsport series, in which she also engages so critically with South African history. I suppose particularly with Maguire, because Maguire's a printmaker, but I think with Shepherd too. And what struck me maybe as something unclear here, where you might be able to amplify for us, is what I note what comes clearly through in Christine Dixie's work is guilt, particularly about her own 1820 settler heritage, in the sense that she feels a sense of personal culpability through birth with the events that transpired. I wonder if there's any kind of thoughts about lineage on either the parts of Maguire or Shepherd.
Oh, absolutely. I just have tucked in here another Maguire that picks up that context of women as victims in the settler wars. Interestingly enough, I'm busy right now writing for a catalogue on Marian's latest works, and they are all about how on earth her ancestors could have thought it was right to do these things in New Zealand. She's exploring it in a very interesting way by going back and looking at how Western ideas and philosophy developed prior to the colonial period. But I think it is very much embedded in her work and Michael's, that they are both very anxious to acknowledge the wrongs that were done in the colonial period. And it's very, what can I say, it's almost daring of them to take on the subject matter. I mean, we've seen the same thing happen in South Africa, that for Pākehā to talk about Maori is really quite tricky. And you might be interested to know that after she did her series on Te Kawaru, Marian felt she had to make some sort of gesture. She showed the works in the area of Taranaki, and they were quite well received. But she decided to make a work as koha, that's a kind of contribution. And here it is. She made this extraordinary fireplace, which picks up on the idea of the volcano of Taranaki. And Peter and I were lucky enough to be invited to the ceremony where it was handed over to this particular group, who have now made her an honorary member, which is very interesting, I think. And Michael, too, he's undertaken different things. He is so fine technically with paint that he recreated the old paints for the Maori Queen to restore some of the Te Rangawaiwai, and for the old canoe, the Te Winika waka, that is in the Waikato Museum. So both of them, in a way, are reflecting, as it were, on their culpability, if you like, as being part of the settler contingent in the conflicts of particularly the 19th century, but they were physical. And today the conflicts continue through things like the settlements around the tribunal settlements.
Thanks so much. And I know there are other questions, so I can't see who the hand is, but can I just hand over? Please just ask.
Wish I could see how to get out of all of this. To end the slideshow, click exit. I wonder what would happen if I do.
I can see it's Philippa's hand now that I've gone to. Philippa, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, that was just so fascinating to listen to, Liz, and amazing to me the kind of microcosmic detail in those works and the way that you talk about them, and their sort of the inferences of them, and the big colonial histories that they represent. I found really fascinating. But what I want to know is, one needs to have quite a lot of knowledge of colonial and cultural history in order to fully appreciate the density of inference. And how do you find audiences, different audiences for these works? How do they relate to them? Do they manage to find meaning in them, or does a lot go over people's heads?
Well, it's a very good question, and of course it was me trying to meet that discrepancy that led to my plotted history at the beginning. But I can certainly give you the answer for Marian Maguire, because Rolf Schneider and I arranged an exhibition of her work in Munich about 5 years ago now, in the Antiken Museum, where they could be shown amongst the Greek vases. It's one of the best collections in the world. And we were all very nervous about how it might be received. We had such a turnout that Peter did nothing but lug chairs around for people to sit on, even though we were talking about her work in English. It was really very heartening. And she's gone on to exhibit in other places in Europe, in Cambridge, in London. Her works are now in the Greenwich collection. They're in the British Museum. So people are perhaps not knowing the detail, but they're still picking up on the general implications. I guess that's the best way to put it. But interestingly, whenever she produces a body of works, she arranges to have a catalogue at the same time. She ran a big print studio for a long time. She now only prints for herself, but she also runs a gallery. And alongside this, it's called Papergraphica, she publishes little catalogues, perhaps acknowledging that people need to know a little bit about the stories in order to get the most out of the works. You would be amused, I'm sure, that when they went to Germany, I'd already done a catalogue on the labours of Heracles. I wrote it, I thought, I just need to sort of check over it for a German audience. And I suddenly discovered there were so many things I had to explain. You know, they wouldn't know that the Endeavour was the ship that Cook was on. They probably wouldn't even know who Cook was, for that matter. But even funnier is that Rolf did a translation, and his translation was about twice as long as the English version.
And what about descendants of settler communities in New Zealand? How did they respond?
Well, her work seems to be much admired and appreciated, but I suppose we need to acknowledge that people who go to art galleries are a relatively select group, are they not? So, but what she was worried about was what the reception might be amongst Maori. And it's been remarkably positive.
Fascinating.
Liz?
I wish you'd all put on your pictures so that I could see you now that I've managed to get back in.
So, Liz,
Kim, you've got hand.
in just before Kim asks her question, because your interface is back. Can I just maybe suggest, Liz, that you press the stop sharing button, the cross that's next to the big red leave button on your screen, and then you should have better access. We should all pop up onto your main screen, and then you'll...
Yes, you are on my screen now. I found out how to make that happen.
I think Kim had her hand up patiently.
Hi, Kim.
Hi, Liz. Just a very quick comment, and thank you so much. I was so delighted to be able to attend this lecture. It's fantastic, and learn about these two artists who are quite remarkable. And I think you actually answered some of my questions to Philippa's question about how these two artists are received and how they work with the community they're representing. I mean, there's this whole issue around having a voice and a voice for who, and so my question was around collaboration, and you showed a slide of the artists working with the Maori community for whom they were doing a monument or a representation, and how does that crossover happen?
Well, all I can say is that both of them are highly aware of this. But in the case of Michael, who, having been very, very popular initially, had kind of faded from view a bit. And I took an exhibition of his work to the Waikato, which is the area that all these works refer to, the battles there and so forth. And again, we did it rather nervously. And it was extremely well received. So again, people seem to be able to sense that these things are done with goodwill, could I say? I don't know, it's very tricky because I'm sure some people take offense, but they sold out all the catalogues that I did, for example.
Wow.
And it's, you know, it's quite a small community, so that was remarkable.
Any other questions for Liz?
Yeah, I do. I think it's remarkable that you've come from outside New Zealand and you've managed to capture all these minutiae of history and the fabulous, rich layers of different cultures in such detail, and to understand it like that, and then to reflect on it. Do you think, Liz, do you think that you had an advantage by not growing up in New Zealand, or did you find it a handicap?
I found it hard work.
Yeah.
Just to give you two examples. So the first time I was writing for a catalogue for Marian, it was about settler history. And I said, oh, I'd love to do it, but I really don't know anything about it. She said, oh, don't worry, she said, I'll send you something to read. A box, a great big box of books arrived. Because she collects in secondhand bookstores. She finds, 19th century histories and diaries and heaven knows what. Michael Shepard, on the other hand, took me on a tiki tour, Peter driving, Michael talking, and me making notes all around the Waikato. We visited every power site. We visited every graveyard. So that, I had a kind of trial by fire. But candidly, Philippa, whatever you're doing needs a lot of research, doesn't it? Sure. I mean, I think about the Voortrekker Monument, 10 years. So, yeah. But there are a lot of nuances that I could very easily miss, and that's where it's been very helpful that both Marian and Michael are very ready to talk about their work.
Yeah.
I'd be hesitant to just write about other artists, though I have, despite the initial objections to the idea, I have now written on quite a few Maori artists, but always at their request.
Yeah. But on a personal level, did you not find it, I'm trying to recall, did you find it somewhat daunting to sort of walk away from the scholarship you'd established in a way and embrace whole new realms of scholarship? Or did you find that there were a lot of concepts and dimensions that you could carry over?
Well, I think we are both colonial countries. So there were some things that carried over. Mm-hmm. But yes, it was very daunting. But, a challenge is something to help you to grow, isn't it?
Yeah.
So is that my answer? A good enough answer?
Fabulous.
There's the two artists ever exhibited together, Maguire.
No, they haven't. They haven't together. They're in different parts of the country. They're on different islands. They admire each other's work. And funnily enough, Marian has offered Michael an exhibition in her gallery.
Wow.
But it hasn't happened yet. So they've sort of got to know each other, I suppose, through me.
Interesting.
So we'll see. Marian's gallery has been very important because she managed to keep it going after the Christchurch earthquakes. Okay. She was actually in the red zone, but and she had numerous exhibitions to fundraise for artists who had lost their studios, their work, everything. So she's a community person. in many respects.
Liz, thank you so much for this. I see no further hands up, and we're out of time. But I'd like to thank you very much for really what was a fascinating talk, which I'm sure all will agree.
Fabulous.
Thank you all for listening. It was nice to be with the UJ family again for a little while. Yep. Perhaps I'll see you all next month.
Thank you very much.
We look forward.
Bye-bye, Liz.
Cheers, everyone.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.